Hello, in this video we're going to look at how to use a variety of different filter effects in Affinity Photo to enhance an image like this. This is my starting image here, and we're going to apply a range of different fixes and effects to come up with something that looks like this. So let's get cracking here. First of all, I'm going to try and pull a bit of detail out of these distant misty areas using the haze removal filter. Now, I'm going to duplicate my background layer here so that I can apply the filter effect to a duplicate of my background. So I'll hit Command or Control and J. That's Command J on a Mac, Control J on a PC to give me a copy of my background layer. And I'm going to double click the layer name here and rename it as Haze Removal. Then I'm going to go to Filter, Haze Removal. Now this gives me a few different sliders here, and we have to wait while the scene is analysed, and then we should see a better result in these misty areas in the distance. You can see we're just able to pull a bit more detail out of the areas around here. Notice how it makes the image slightly darker, but I can make the effect selective in a minute, so I'm not worried too much about that. I'm going to adjust the exposure correction here, and we can tweak the strength. Let's bring the strength to around about there, I think, and tweak these until we get a decent result, and I'm happy with that, so I'll hit Apply. Now if we zoom out to full screen with Command or Control and 0, and if I toggle that top layer off and on, you can see how that's affecting my image. But I'd like to restrict the effect to that distant area there on the river. Now to do this, I'm going to add a layer mask. So I'll click the layer mask icon here at the bottom of the layers panel, and notice how that adds a mask attached to my haze removal layer. Now I can highlight that mask and then start painting. So I'm going to hit B for my brush tool, and I'm going to make sure my foreground color is set to black here, and then I can start painting to hide the effect in the rest of the image. So I'm just going to paint around these areas here, and notice that just restricts the haze removal effect to that area in the distance. And now if I toggle that top layer off and on, you can see how that's working. And this is the great thing about using layer masks in combination with filter effects. We can restrict them to different areas of our photo like this. Now let's add another filter effect. This time, rather than going to the filter menu, I'm going to actually go to the layer menu here, and notice we have the new live filter layer options here, and I'm going to choose the perspective filter. Now notice when I choose any of these filters in the layers panel over here, we see a new layer appear, and this is my new live filter layer. And the great thing about this is the effect remains on its own separate layer here, but affects all of the layers underneath it, just like an adjustment layer. So with the perspective filter here, I can start adjusting the grid by dragging the corner points. Now, you might have noticed my image here is slightly wonky, but I can fix that. And we could, of course, fix this by cropping, but if we cropped it, what we'd have to do is crop into the image and lose some of the edge details. So we can use perspective instead if we want to change the wonky horizon but not lose too much of the edges of the image. So I can drag this top point here upwards, and you can see how that allows me to straighten out the horizon like this. And I'm happy with that, so I can just close down my live perspective dialog box here. And now if I toggle that perspective layer off and on, you can see how that's affecting my image. And I can double click the live filter here if I need to go back into the settings. I could perhaps make it slightly higher just to level it out a bit more, and again just toggle it off. So that's a really powerful feature within Affinity Photo here, these live filter layers. And I'm going to add another one now, so I'm going to go to layer and again, new live filter layer. This time I'm going to add a blur filter. Now there are a range of really good blur filters here in Affinity Photo. I quite like some of these depth of field filters, but for this image I'm going to use the motion blur filter here. And this allows me to blur along a line here, so you can see if I increase the radius here. In fact, at the moment nothing's happening, and that's because if we look over in my layers panel here, my motion blur filter has actually appeared as a child of my perspective filter, so it's kind of attached to my perspective filter here. So what I want to do is drag the motion blur filter here to the top of the layer stack here, so that it's not kind of attached to anything else, it's just affecting all of the layers below it. And now you can see exactly what's happening here. If we zoom in a little closer here, it's blurring my image in a horizontal plane like this. So I'm going to adjust the radius. What I want to do is blur some of this detail on the water here, because I think when it's sharp it looks a bit distracting. So I'm going to increase the radius here just to give me a touch of motion blur on the water, and that's enough. I think I'm going to turn it off now, and again we can mask the effect to make it selective. So I'm going to click the add layer mask icon here to add a mask to my motion blur live filter, and again what we can do is zoom back out and grab the brush tool, paint with black to hide the effect in areas where we don't want it. So I'll just paint over the land here and those sharp details to hide the effects of the blur filter in these areas. And again, if I toggle the blur filter off and on, you can see now how it's only really affecting that area here that we wanted to keep soft. Again, I'll turn it off and on, and it gives me a nice subtle blur over these areas here. You can perhaps just fine tune where it's affecting by painting with white over that area. So that's the great control we have with layer mask. We can either hide or reveal parts of our layers, including our live filter layers. Now, another useful live filter layer we have available to us is the high pass filter. So I'm going to go to layer, new live filter layer again, and this time let's go for high pass. And this gives me a rather unappealing looking grey image, and as I drag the radius across you can see the edges begin to appear within the image. The further I drag, the stronger those edges become. Now, the reason why we want to apply this effect is because we can use it in combination with a blend mode. So I'm going to go to the blend mode drop down here at the top of the layers panel, and I'm going to change this to overlay. Now what we get with high pass is a nice sharpening effect that will allow me to sharpen up and crisp up the details. Now if I drag the radius slider here, you can see the further I drag, the sharper the details get within the image. So you can see that's pushed slightly too far. I can bring it down a little bit until we get a nice level of sharpening over the details. Again, I can toggle my live filter layer off and on, and you can see the effect that has. In fact, that's probably slightly too much. So let's bring it down a little bit lower to around about there. Now, there's one other kind of effect that we can apply that isn't strictly speaking a filter, but it's a useful array of tonal settings, and these can be found within the tone mapping persona up here. Now, to do this, I first of all need to merge a copy of all of my layers here. So I can use a keyboard shortcut for this. Command or Control plus Shift, Alt and E will allow me to merge a copy of all of my layers into one single layer here at the top of my layer stack. Now, I can take this layer into the tone mapping persona. So I'll click the tone mapping persona up here. Now, this is normally used for HDR effects, but we can also apply those kind of tonal effects to a single image like this, instead of applying it to a set of images as we would in a normal HDR workflow. And now if we go over to the left side over here, you can see we get these range of different presets here, and we can choose from this drop down at the top here. There are some in this James Ritson custom set here that I quite like, so we can just click through these to apply them to our image. I quite like this urban bright effect here, so I think we'll leave it at that, and then I can hit apply to add the effect to my image. So this isn't strictly speaking a filter, as I say, but it is a way to create a tonal effect using those HDR controls. And then we can, of course, adjust the opacity of that top layer if we need to tone down the effect if we think it's a bit too strong. So we have control over it using these layer settings like opacity. So there we go, that's my finished image. That's a quick introduction to some of the useful filters and filter functions within Affinity Photo. And the great thing about this is my image remains completely editable because all of my effects are on separate layers here, so I can turn them all off and then we'll turn them on one by one. So let's go through our image here. First of all, we use the haze removal to bring back a bit of detail in those background areas here, and then we use the layer mask to make it selective. We fixed our wonky horizon with the perspective live filter layer. We added a touch of motion blur to the water using another live filter layer, and again used the layer mask to make it selective. We then used the high pass live filter layer to apply a touch of sharpening before finally taking our image into the tone mapping persona to give us a slightly different tonal effect.